Hello, and welcome to the second installment of our GMAT Club RC series. My name's Haley Cusimano. I am a GMAT tutor, instructor, and content creator, and I'm psyched to be here with you guys to talk a little bit about what happens when passages and their corresponding questions become a little more challenging. And it's one of my favorite topics to talk about because it tends to be pretty overlooked in terms of opportunity areas. And by all means, those of you guys who are joining me live, go ahead and give me a quick hello. Let me know where you're tuning in from. Psyched to be here with you. It looks like we've got a couple of familiar, I suppose not faces, but names in the chat from my past session. So psyched to have you guys back here with me. Let's go ahead and chat a little bit about what we've got on the docket for today. So we're going to be running for about 45 minutes or so, with the last perhaps 10 minutes reserved for Q&A. So as you guys have questions, feel free to pop those questions into the chat, and I'd be happy to talk kind of big picture around reading comprehension strategy as well. But I'm planning on having us dig into one of my favorite advanced passages. And it's one of my favorites because it really helps to recognize some of the most common constructions for how the GMAT will take the same skill sets, the same takeaways, the same kind of critical thinking components, and test you at a more precise level using higher level constructs. So we're going to talk about some of those higher level constructs today in the context of a passage. Now, if you were here with me in my lesson last week, or perhaps if you're not tuning in live quite a while ago, we talked a little bit about reading for why the information is there, more so than just what the information is saying. Because at its core, we want to make sure we're comfortable with why the author has chosen to include each piece of information so that we can build that into why the passage as a whole is there. And we can more efficiently tackle big picture questions like the primary purpose, the main idea, what the author would agree or disagree with. And we've got a good mental outline going to be able to dig into those detail-driven and inference questions. Now, today we're going to be talking a little more about how to connect that big picture to those details, to those inferences, and the types of constructions you might expect to face as passages become a little more challenging. And so to make sure that we've got plenty of time to dig into the corresponding questions, I'm actually going to just let you guys loose on this passage. So I'll share my screen for you. For those of you guys having a difficult time seeing the passage on screen, I'll go ahead and toss a link to the GMAT Club page for this passage into the chat for you. And what we're going to do is we're just going to take a quick 3 minutes on our own. So a quick 3 minutes to walk through the process of paragraph by paragraph, pausing at the close of each paragraph to see if, in the context of a small blurb of less than a sentence, you can address why that paragraph was there so that we can build that together into the function of the passage as a whole, and we'll be well prepared to tackle the big picture questions that appear on this passage. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you and let you guys loose on this first passage. And as I mentioned, it's one of my favorites, perhaps not because it's the most interesting passage in the world, you guys might beg to differ, but because it really tasks us to think really critically about what's happening in the context of the passage. And so what I'd like to do is I'm going to go ahead and give you guys 3 minutes. I'll hop off screen for those 3 minutes to read paragraph by paragraph, pause at the close of each paragraph, and see if you can address why that paragraph is there. And then we're going to talk together about building that into the function of the passage, what things I'm hoping you took away from that passage in the initial read through, and how we can use those takeaways to be question focused when we tackle those corresponding questions. So just worry about the passage for now. Go ahead and take 3 minutes, and then we will chat about it together. All right, so hopefully that should have been arguably a little too much time. During our first lesson, we spoke a little bit about pacing strategies for reading comprehension specifically. And I mentioned this idea that while we want to build on our reading comprehension efficiency, while we want to build on our natural reading speed, what we don't want to do is we don't want to hit a point to where we try to outpace that natural reading comprehension speed by the time we hit test day. We want to do everything that we can to up that efficiency, to move as efficiently through each corresponding paragraph as we can. But by the time we hit test day, it doesn't do you a ton of good to say, I have 90 seconds and precisely that and no more, and then I'm moving on to the questions, because if you move through the passage at a pace that doesn't allow you to absorb the information, you probably have done yourself a little bit of a disservice. Now, we're going to go ahead and take a moment to talk together about what's happening paragraph by paragraph in this passage. And let's start with paragraph 1. So in the context of a couple of words, and it doesn't need to be super eloquently worded, I just want to hear from you guys on your perspective. What did you gather as the function of paragraph 1? What was paragraph 1 trying to get at? Why was it there? Because if we can make a conscious effort of pausing at the close of each paragraph to ask ourselves that, even when there's no one on the other end to hear what we have to say, we're going to be in a better spot to make sure that we never hit the end of the passage and go, wait a second, what did I just read? Right? We're going to be able to maintain that focus. We're going to be able to make sure that we're reading for the right components without getting lost in the details, because this was a pretty detail-driven passage. So we've started off by addressing that in current historiography, the picture of a consistent, unequivocal decline in women's status with the advent of capitalism and industrialization is giving way to an analysis that not only emphasizes change in continuity, but also accounts for geographical and occupational variation. Whew, what a first sentence, right? There's a lot going on, ton of modifying phrases in the mix. Let's try to whittle it down a little bit. And the first takeaway that I want to point out is that to do so, we can actually kind of recycle from some of our sentence correction strategies. So we never really want to look at any of our strategies for verbal in a vacuum and ignore them when we get to different question constructions. Yeah, there are certain processes that are going to be more helpful in some question types than they are on other question types. But in this case, if we can take a step back and really just dig into what's happening in this first sentence without all of the excess that's there to distract us, it's going to help kickstart our path through understanding this entire passage, because everything after the first sentence is just a supporting detail. It's just a supporting example. When I say the history of women's work in English farmhouse cheesemaking between 1800 and 1930 is a case in point, we're saying it is an example of that. And then we go on to clarify that example throughout the rest of paragraph 1, throughout paragraph 2, and again in paragraph 3. So we want to make sure we've really taken the time to dig into what's happening in this first sentence, because it's the conclusion of our passage. So in this case, if we're looking to this first sentence and we whittle away some of the excess, we whittle away some of the modifying phrases that are ultimately just there to distract us, right? We're saying the picture. What picture? Well, of a consistent, unequivocal decline in women's status with the advent of capitalism and industrialization. All of this is just modifying terminology, right? We know that from our sentence correction approach. So we're saying the picture is giving way to an analysis, and then we go on to describe that analysis. So what does it mean when we say giving way? The picture is giving way to an analysis. Anyone have thoughts for me there? So when we say giving way, we mean that it's being replaced, that it's being replaced and overtaken by, that we've got this old perspective, this old picture that says, women's status just plummeted when capitalism came into play. And that picture is shifting, it's giving way, right? It's being replaced and overtaken by a new analysis that says, hey, there's probably more we need to be considering here, right? We need to account for differences in different geographical regions, differences with different cultural values, with different elements coming into play. Essentially, abandon is not a terrible way to put that. Yeah, is we're shifting away from this old perspective and into the new perspective. And seeing that right off the bat allows us to contextualize what's happening in the rest of the passage, because the whole rest of the passage is examples set through the lens of this author, Pinchbeck. Right? So we'll probably want to be thinking about why they chose to include pinchbeck in every single paragraph of this passage to contextualize our examples. Because when we have an example that appears across the entire passage, there's a pretty decent chance that they may task us to understand why that example's been included, and we're going to see a little later on that that's going to be the case in one of our questions. So in this case, paragraph 1 addresses this idea that we have this old perspective, it's being replaced, it's shifting, it's being overtaken by a new perspective or a new way of thinking that says, hey, there's more we've got to consider. And then we begin an example. And paragraph 2 continues this example. We say, though pinchbeck portrayed X, recent scholarship says Y. And the X and the Y of it all don't really matter to us until we're asked about it. If we have a question that asks us about local markets and fairs, we know the bulk of that information is in paragraph 2. But for the time being, we want to address that it's an example of what the author was getting at in the beginning of paragraph 1. And paragraph 3 actually plays a really similar role, right? So pinchbeck missed X. Here are some components that merit consideration. Right? And in particular, toward the close of paragraph 3, we've got all this language around, okay, well, in England versus in America, and in cheese dairying versus arable agriculture that tells me, hey, we've got some comparison and contrast language. And just like I mentioned last week, that's another one to pay really close attention to. Because when you have this comparison and contrast language in the mix, well, there's also a decent chance that the author of these questions is setting you up for a question that deals with comparison and contrast. And once again, we're going to see that come up in a later question as well. So if we were going to pull the context of paragraph 1, the context of paragraph 2, and the context of paragraph 3 into the meaning of the passage as a whole, if you had to answer the question, why is this passage here? How would you do so in a couple of words? I want to hear from you guys a little bit first before we formally dig into our first question, which happens to ask us for the primary purpose. Because even if a primary purpose question came up as the third question in your set, as the fourth question in your set, I'd want to make sure you'd taken a moment to pause and address that big picture, address that primary purpose before you encounter that very first question, because it's going to put you on the right track for pretty much all the questions that we encounter. It helps us to contextualize the why so that even when we're asked about the what, even when we're asked about those details, we can think about how they puzzle into the bigger picture. So, why is this passage here? Because if you misinterpreted that first sentence, you could have gone a completely different direction with this passage. And it's part of what happens in advanced RC constructions, is that if we read for the modifiers rather than reading for the core of the sentence, just like we've learned in sentence correction, it can lead us astray pretty seriously. So in this case, we're saying, hey, the way that we think about the impact of capitalism and industrialization on women's status is shifting. Here's an example of that, right? Here's some context through the lens of pinchbeck versus recent scholarship. Now, I'm going to go ahead and let you guys lead the way through this first question. So just toss your answers into the chat. Hopefully, with this kind of big picture approach, we should be able to move through primary purpose questions fairly efficiently. Although I will preface this by saying this first one's a little bit tricky. So I'm going to go ahead and give you guys 90 seconds on your own to dig in and see if you can address for me the primary purpose of the passage as it corresponds to our options over here on the right-hand side. So go ahead and take 90 seconds, just see where you get, and then we're going to talk about how this digs into a high-level approach for a slightly more advanced reading comprehension passage. Okay, so seeing a little participation in the chat on this one. If you have a lean, even if you're not 100% confident on it, go ahead and toss that into the chat just so I've got a sense of where everyone's coming from, because as of right now, to a somewhat minor margin, answer choice B seems to be the highest contender, and answer choice B is not our correct answer. We're going to talk about why. So in this case, we've got a lot of really powerful wrong answer constructions that are designed to kind of trap us. Now, we're just going to take these step by step so that you can see what I mean here. Because even if we have a component of that answer choice that we find really likable, that we find really fits the bill, as soon as one component of that answer choice is incorrect, as soon as one component of that answer choice doesn't fit, we can eliminate it. An answer choice that is 99% correct is 100% wrong. Our job isn't to puzzle components of the answer choice and try to make them fit the bill of our passage. Our job is to be scrutinous. Our job is to be suspicious of these answer choices and say, all right, is there anything here that maybe doesn't fit? And that's exactly what we're going to do as we move through these answer options. And yeah, we took a moment to kind of preempt or pre-think the direction of that correct answer, but we want to keep in mind that we've done that so that we can find the meaning across the answer options. The wording could be pretty drastically different, and in this case, it's going to be. So when we look to answer choice A, present recently discovered evidence that supports a conventional interpretation of a historical period. Are we trying to say that this evidence is recently discovered? And furthermore, is it supporting a conventional interpretation, the commonly held belief, what most people think about the topic? Absolutely not. On both accounts, we've got problematic language. We've got some precision in language that just doesn't fit what we're looking for. Now, quite a few of you guys were originally swayed toward answer choice B. So let's talk about what we can pinpoint that is problematic about B and thus makes it incorrect. Because describe how reinterpretations of available evidence sounds great. That sounds like exactly what we were talking about, right? But describe how reinterpretations of available evidence have reinvigorated a once discredited scholarly position. Are we saying that this position is once discredited? No, right? We're saying that this is a brand new perspective, that we're shifting gears and we're taking more into account that we didn't necessarily analyze or include before. So answer choice B, problematic as well. Yeah, and that's exactly right, Jared, is we want to be taking the context of each paragraph and building it into the context of the passage as a whole. Now, we did that pretty quickly when we went through this particular example, because I pointed out that paragraphs 2 and 3 both just provided additional supporting evidence. They both just provided additional supporting examples that tied back to the conclusion that was given to us right up front, right? So part of success and part of efficiency on reading comprehension is being able to prioritize information as you read through, being able to synthesize and say, hey, I can tell that this is conclusion language, that this is something I need to pay really close attention to, versus, oh, is a case in point, is an example. All right, I want to know that this is an example, but the function here is it's an example supporting what we said in that sentence before, right? So in a similar realm, kind of thinking back to this idea of breaking things down using sentence correction constructions, answer choice C, explaining why some historians have tended to emphasize change rather than continuity in discussing a particular period. Well, if we think back to the constructions we had going on in the corresponding sentence here, we're saying an analysis that not only emphasizes both change and continuity, but also accounts for geographical and occupational variation. So if you guys are familiar with not only and but also as a sentence construction that appears in sentence correction, we can take some of those same takeaways here once again. Again, these concepts are not tested, these strategies are not tested in a vacuum. Not only change and continuity, but also geographical and occupational variation. Well, then the change and continuity were both on the not only end of this spectrum, they're both the old perspective. So we're not contrasting change versus continuity. That's not the point of this passage, right? And nor, let's talk about D, because D was the one that everyone shifted to pretty quickly once I told you guys that B was wrong. With answer choice D, Explore how changes in a particular occupation serve to counter the prevailing view. Countering the prevailing view, again, sounds pretty great, sounds pretty on point. But do we have current things that are changing, that are happening, that are moving a different direction in the realm of women's status with the advent of capitalism and industrialization right now? Are we talking about current changes? Are there new things happening that are shifting people's perspectives in the realm of current historiography? No, not according to the passage. Again, as you guys mentioned, when you were initially convinced by answer choice B, we're reinterpreting stuff that we've known for a long time. We're taking a different lens to it. We're looking at it a little differently. So answer choice D doesn't fit our mix either. Now, nobody really tends to like answer choice E right off the bat. And there's a reason for that. So in this case, if I had given you, if an answer choice had said, and it wouldn't because it's too straightforward and a little too wordy, right? If an answer choice had said, use the example of women's work in English farmhouse cheesemaking to show that the way we interpret women's status with the advent of capitalism, right, with the onset of capitalism, is shifting. Well, that's pretty much word for word the way we analyzed the big picture, the primary purpose of the passage. And that's exactly what answer choice E says. It just says it way more vaguely. It just uses way less precise terms. And something being vague doesn't make it wrong. Something being specific in the wrong way makes it wrong. So students will have this kind of dislike of vague, ambiguous sounding answer options, even if those vague, somewhat ambiguous sounding answer options fit the bill pretty precisely. And the GMAT will kind of landmine these correct answer constructions with words that just aren't the way we would have described it. A general scholarly trend. You might not have used the terminology general scholarly trend to address things here, but that's what we're looking at, right? If in current historiography, we're seeing this shift in perspective, well, yeah, we could call that a general scholarly trend. So even if you wouldn't have called it a scholarly trend, or you wouldn't have called it a phenomenon, or you wouldn't have called it, unexpected, if it fits the bill, if it fits the context of our passage, make sure that you're using that process of elimination to get rid of answer options that have something definitively wrong with them and not just use different terms than what we would have first thought of. Can you tell us how I was able to figure out the primary purpose in my head? So how did I find the bigger picture? It's kind of a combination of that process that I just mentioned of synthesizing the information and prioritizing it. A lot of success on the GMAT is just how well do we prioritize information, right? And being able to verbalize that in a way that holds on to the original meaning of the passage, that doesn't paraphrase away the big picture. So in this case, I was able to do so by recognizing the function of information throughout the passage. I mentioned that beyond about our first sentence, the function of the information in our passage is to provide supporting examples. So as soon as I've identified that that's the case, I can shift that primary purpose toward the conclusion language that I've been given in the very first sentence and just make sure that I've correctly analyzed what the heck that big dense sentence is trying to say. And in this case, it's telling us the picture is giving way to an analysis, right? The image that we have of women's status with the advent of capitalism is shifting. So that'll vary a little bit, passage by passage. You'll have some passages like the one that we looked at last week where we really need to build and say, hey, what's the connection of the first paragraph to the second paragraph to the third paragraph? How can I use things like contrast and continuation language? Evidence and conclusion language, yeah, as Jared's addressing kind of trigger words that indicate to me that what I'm looking at is a big picture conclusion versus a supporting detail. So when I see is a case in point, right, or when I see for example, right, I know that I'm looking at supporting details. And I want to think about not what those details are. I don't want to become a subject matter expert on what women were doing in cheese making in the 1800s to 1900s. Like that's not the point here. The point is to see, hey, why did the author choose to include these details and how do they tie back to that big picture? And the way that we did that in this case, which was admittedly a really challenging example, the way that we did that is by breaking down and making sure we understood the why and the meaning behind what was happening in sentence one. Yeah. Pretty tricky one. And I will say it's also not a super uncommon structure. This structure where they put the bottom line up top. They're like, hey, here's what we're going to talk about. And then they dig into a whole bunch of supporting detail. And that's exactly what they've done here. Now, our next question is going to have us dig into that supporting detail. So I'm going to go ahead and once again, let you guys loose, give you 90 seconds to lead the way, and see if you can address, regarding English local markets and fairs, which of the following can be inferred from the passage? Go ahead and take a look at question 2 for me. All right, so accuracy is a little more happening on this one, and I would argue this is definitely the most straightforward question of the set. So we're asked regarding English local markets and fairs, what can be inferred? Now, when we're looking to detail-driven questions or inference-driven questions, there are two kind of main methods of attack. If the inference or the detail, right, if the support that we're going to glean from the passage could come from throughout the entire passage, we likely want to skim and get rid of any answer options that are just flat out clearly and obviously wrong first, and then cycle back to the passage on an answer choice by answer choice basis as we need to. But if we know that a particular question stem is pointing us to one precise part of the passage, right? So it's pointing us to a specific supporting detail. We know where that detail is because we've created that mental outline. Well, we can go ahead and cycle back. But what we don't want to do is we don't want to sit and reread entire paragraphs or the entire passage all over again every time we hit a detail-driven question, right? Because that means that we probably weren't reading with the right perspective in the first place. Now, I mentioned when we were going through our analysis that if a question asked us about English markets and fairs, we'd probably know where to look for support. And that paragraph I was referring to is paragraph 2, where we talk about the fact that scholars note that women's control seldom extended to the disposal of the proceeds. In the case of cheese, they might not have been able to market the cheese, but then we go on to say merely selling the cheese did not necessarily imply access to the money. And then we've provided an example where we say, hey, like if the husband took all of the wife's cheese sales money, then it didn't necessarily represent all that much financial independence in the first place, right? So in this case, we can use a little process of elimination. And inference questions are hands down process of elimination driven questions, because in order for something to be inferred, it needs to be more or less guaranteed by the context of the passage. The passage has to absolutely logically connect to that inference. And in this case, it does with our correct answer, which, as just about everybody mentioned, is answer choice B. Knowing who the active sellers were at these venues may not give a reliable indication of who controlled the revenue. That's precisely what all of our support in paragraph 2 was saying. Hey, Pinchbeck was saying they had it better in the first place, but well, if they didn't get to keep the money, this may not have necessarily represented all that much financial freedom at the start. Now, we can also use a little process of elimination here. We don't know that both before and after the agricultural revolution, the sellers were men. They specifically told us women were involved in selling the cheese before this point. We aren't guaranteed that there were no parallel institutions at which American cheesemakers could sell their goods just because they didn't include it in the passage. This is another really common theme. Just because something isn't in the passage doesn't mean that it doesn't exist in the world of what's happening in the passage. So just because they haven't mentioned it doesn't mean that it could not exist or could not be true. So again, as soon as an answer option could be false, we can get rid of it. Now, actually, normally the answer option that tends to get the most attention of our wrong answer constructions is answer option D. Prior to the agricultural revolution, the sellers were generally the producers themselves. And answer choice D sounds pretty great on first glance, right? Women were involved in making the cheese and women were involved in selling the cheese. But they didn't tell us that it was the same woman moving through every step of the process. So this is also not guaranteed to be true. It could be true, but if it doesn't comply with that must be true parameter on an inference question, we can eliminate it. And on high level reading comprehension questions, they'll very often ask us to make that distinction a little more precisely. They'll give us answer options that definitely could be true, right? They might even be very likely to be true. But as soon as they could be false, they're not contenders. Again, same thing I was talking about earlier, that if an answer choice is 99% correct, well, then it's 100% wrong. And Doc, to your point with answer option E, prior to the agricultural revolution, women sold not only cheese, but also products of arable agriculture. There is no support here that tells us that these products of arable agriculture were sold at markets and fairs. Right? We talk about this comparison and contrast of women's involvement in arable agriculture in paragraph 3, but we don't contextualize what that involvement looks like, what step in the process they might have been involved in, and we certainly don't specify particularly enough to be able to say that they definitely sold these items at markets and fairs. So again, certainly could be true, right? Could be true. But as soon as it could be false, we can eliminate it. And in this case, just saying that they were involved in arable agriculture does not tell us that they sold products of arable agriculture at English markets and fairs. This has taken this a step too far, right? It's gone too extreme to be something that we can guarantee on the basis of the information we've been given in the passage. Making sense? So again, process of elimination is going to be our very first step, our key to success on these inference questions, keeping in mind that our distinction here is must be true versus could be false. One final thing I'll note, because occasionally this will catch students up with answer option B, is something being too directly stated does not make it not an inference. This is huge. All the time I'll have students come to me and they'll say, well, wait a second, they told us this in the passage, so it's not an inference, it's a detail. Something being too directly stated doesn't make it not an inference. Now you'll want to be careful. You'll want to be suspicious of that answer option and say, okay, is it really this easy? Or is there something about the precision in language, the order that they've presented me with components of the argument? Is there something here I should be paying more attention to? But don't eliminate an inference answer option because it was stated rather than inferred. It's not a thing. So inference questions also tested on critical reasoning. Could you explain the difference? So we're actually going to take a very, very similar approach to inferences in critical reasoning. I actually think I have a video live dealing with inference questions specifically for GMAT Club as well. If so, I can link you to it. But essentially, we still comply with this must be true versus could be false parameter. The difference is honestly primarily in the length of the stimulus, in how much filtering through information we need to do to be able to find what must be true versus could be false. But the process is essentially the same. We got the same core components at play. Yep. And actually with that, I'm going to transition us into our next question because I want to make sure we've got time for these final two. They're good ones. And I want to let you guys talk a little bit about why the passage includes pinchback. Remember I mentioned when we were going through analysis, all right, she showed up in paragraph 1, she's back again in paragraph 2, and we've included what she's missed along the way in paragraph 3. So there's a pretty decent chance that we're being asked to contextualize why the author continually cites back to pinchback as an example. Essentially, what would we lose if we took her perspective out of the mix? And at that, I'm going to go ahead and give you guys 90 seconds to dig into question 3 and just see where you get. So toss your answers into the chat. All right, so I've got a lot of the chat feeling really comfortable on this one. And again, I want to point out that this was the other question construction that I mentioned should feel really natural to move through pretty efficiently if you've been reading the passage for the right context. So we got this idea that in the bigger picture, we've got this shift, right? So we used to think about women's status this way, but our perspective is shifting. It's giving way to a new analysis. We used to have this old perspective. It's being replaced and overtaken by a new perspective. So in the context of the passage, where does pinchbeck fit into the mix? We used to have this old perspective. It's being replaced and overtaken by a new perspective. Where does pinchbeck fit into this spectrum? If in the paragraphs that follow, we say, though pinchbeck says X, recent scholarship says Y. Pinchbeck missed X, but we can see that Y is the case. So where does pinchbeck fit into this mix if we've got old perspective is being replaced or overtaken by a new perspective, a new way of thinking, a more robust analysis? Well, pinchbeck's going to be that old perspective, right? So providing an instance of a viewpoint that according to the passage's author is being superseded, is being replaced and overtaken is exactly what we're looking at, right? It's exactly what we're looking for here. So we want to make sure that we can eliminate our other answer options along the way. But in this case, saying that it's providing an instance, it's providing an example of the old perspective to contrast with this new way of thinking with recent scholarship with current historiography. So demonstrating that some of the conclusions were anticipated in earlier scholarship, now we've got a contrast here, not a continuation. And that gives us equal means for elimination of answer option C, right? Providing a point of reference for subsequent scholarship also doesn't address this point of contrast. If they had just included the facts, if they had just included the details and they had taken pinchbeck's perspective away from the mix, we wouldn't lose this kind of information or point of reference, we would lose the point of contrast. And so that's what pinchbeck's inclusion brings to the table. And E, this is another really common wrong answer construction here. Showing the effect that specialization introduces, well, the examples that we introduce from her perspective do that. Like they talk about how specialization impacted women's work in the agricultural industrial revolutions, but that isn't why her examples are there. It's not why they've brought things up from her perspective. Things have been brought up from her perspective to create this contrast of there was an old perspective, it's being replaced by a new perspective. And so this ties me back to that same takeaway of focusing on the why rather than focusing on the what, because it allows us to answer questions that deal with the function really efficiently, and it saves us time to dig back into the details for things like our inferences, like the one that we're going to talk about in just a moment. So, higher level questions don't demand more advanced content knowledge. They don't ask us completely new and different constructions. They're going to ask us to be more precise. They're going to make correct answers a little less punchy. They're going to use terminology and wording that's just different than what you would have chosen. And they're going to make wrong answer choices sound a little more convincing by dressing up part of that answer option to sound a whole lot like what you thought you were looking for, even though there's something else landmining it later on in the answer choice. So with that, if you guys have questions on this one, let me know. Otherwise, I want to make sure we've got a moment for some Q&A. So let's go ahead and dig into this last question. Here we're asked, it can be inferred from the passage that women did work in. Now, if we scan the answer options, we'll probably have a pretty decent idea of where to find the relevant support here. But I'll again draw your attention to the fact that we're looking at an inference. And because we're looking at an inference, we're looking to differentiate the answer option that must be true from the answer options that could be false. And with that, once again, I'm going to give you guys 90 seconds to do so. Okay, so we got a little more variation going on in this last question. Most of our answer options had at least something to like about them, but the key here is that all but one of them are going to have something to dislike about it. So let's talk a little bit about where we're finding the relevant support. If we scan our answer options, we've got kind of America versus England and dairying versus arable agriculture. So we're probably at least primarily going to be looking to the support that was presented to us in all of those comparison and contrasts that came up in paragraph 3. So we're looking to differentiate what could be false from what must be true, because the correct answer on an inference question is the one that is guaranteed by the information presented to us in either the passage in reading comprehension or the stimulus in critical reasoning. So in this case, we're gonna go bottom up on this one. We're gonna start with answer option E. Some areas of American cheese dairying after industrialization. What? They told us that they disappeared from American cheese dairying, right? If we disappeared early on from American cheese dairying, we certainly can't say they were still involved in American cheese dairying after industrialization. And similarly, we know that they disappeared from the sale of cheese at local markets in England. That's what they told us throughout paragraph 2. Now, arable agriculture in Southeast England after the agricultural revolution in those locales in which cultural values supported their participation. They used a whole bunch of buzzwords that appeared in the passage to try to distract you here. But essentially, this isn't something that's guaranteed to be true either. In fact, they told us that they disappeared from arable agriculture in Southeast England. So this isn't something that we can guarantee to be true. Nor is answer option B. We didn't address Northern England. Doesn't have to be true. Can certainly eliminate it. Let's talk about answer option A, because this is a super common construction on high-level inference questions. American cheesemaking at some point prior to industrialization. Well, in the passage, we say we have early disappearance from American cheese dairying. So in order to disappear from somewhere, don't you have to have been there at some point in the first place? You can't disappear from somewhere you've never been. I know this is pretty powerful logic stuff here, but realistically, in order to disappear from American cheesemaking, you have to have been there at some point in the first place. And that's exactly what answer option A is getting at. So while it's not necessarily distinctly spoken in the passage, it is something that is directly guaranteed based on information we have been given in the passage. And that's what we're going to look to on high-level constructions. So in many cases, high-level inferences will do things like say, hey, here's the comparison and contrast of before and after. We've told you about after. Now draw conclusions for us about what happened before. Or we've given you this comparison between two components. We've told you A is larger than B. So can you, in an inference question, conclude that B is smaller than A, right? Can you kind of invert that logic and think about it in a different direction? Or if I give you a cause and effect, can you address this kind of cause and effect rationale in this construction? And does this give from paragraph 1 as well? Not in a way that directly creates that kind of emphatic support that we would need for an inference, because paragraph 1 pretty much exclusively deals with what's happening in England at the time. So there is a little bit of precision in language happening in question 4, where we need to be able to dig in and identify, hey, where are we talking about and when are we talking about, so that we can keep things kind of organized to address the comparison and contrast from the correct perspective. Yeah, so pretty tricky stuff, but essentially question 4, and it's one of my favorites for that reason. Question 4 just comes down to the fact that in order to disappear from somewhere, you got to have been there in the first place. So if you guys have lingering questions, those of you who aren't tuning in live, or once we wrap up today's session, definitely feel free to ask them in the chat, to ask them in the comments, or you can go ahead and tag me and let me know on the actual GMAT Club page for this passage. But essentially, what I wanted us to take away and what I wanted us to gather from this passage is one that causes a lot of students a little bit of headache, is that when we look to higher level reading comprehension constructions, right? Those higher level reading comprehension constructions aren't asking us to be subject matter experts. They're not asking us to bring knowledge into the mix. And in fact, anytime I've worked with someone who happened to have a lot of knowledge about the field of history or the field of science or the field of business that was being tested, it way more frequently disadvantaged them than it did advantage them, right? Then provide an advantage. So we want to focus on prioritizing the information that we have, synthesizing as we go and saying, hey, what is it that the author's trying to accomplish with this paragraph? Building that into what the author's trying to accomplish with the passage as a whole, and using that to guide our process through the corresponding questions. A couple of other things we want to keep in mind here, right? An answer choice that's 99% correct is 100% wrong. Our job isn't to try to make a case for answer options, to say, all right, I could see how maybe if I puzzle it in the right light and this, that, and the other thing were true, this could be right. It's to find something wrong with all but one of our answer options. And if we can do that, we're going to be able to really consistently arrive at the correct answer, even when they've dressed that correct answer down with constructions that are unusual, that just aren't quite the way we would have worded it, right? General scholarly trend might not have been quite the way you would have worded it, but it fits the bill. And it'll allow us to weed away answer options where they've chosen to address one part of that construction in exactly the way we thought we were looking for. But they've landmined it later on in the answer option, elsewhere in the answer option, with something that just doesn't fit, that's just flat out wrong. And so the idea here is that if we can build the foundations, if we can build our process, success on higher level reading comprehension and on higher level verbal in general just comes from a little more precision in how we apply those strategies, how we apply those processes that we've already gotten started on the easy to medium level stuff. So it's all about building from the foundations. Some of that's going to come from allowing yourself the time to dig in and understand the passage, to build the foundation in how you read for reading comprehension before you become too time conscious about things. A lot of that's going to come from reflecting on how you performed in those questions. And when you went wrong, not just, all right, I get it now that it was explained to me, or now that I read through the explanation, but what was it about a wrong answer construction that convinced you? And what about the correct answer caused you to eliminate it? Because that's where we get the really powerful feedback that allows us to learn more about who we are as test takers and to make those adjustments and corrections, right? To be able to more powerfully address questions like that in the future. So with that, I am running a little low on time. I do want to address this really quickly though. Gerard says, should we read the whole passage or only first sentences and make the big picture? I know there are a lot of different strategies out there. I will tell you that while for some other standardized tests, processes like that try to cheat the system by having you read just the portions that we think statistically are going to be more important, might have some application. I do not find them to be particularly helpful in the context of the GMAT. There are just too many cases where constructions that sit somewhere in the middle of the paragraph, that sit toward the middle of the passage, can still be just as powerful. They really can. And so I would not make that suggestion. I would suggest reading through the entire thing, but being able to prioritize information, to not skim, but to read with less emphasis on, memorization or tucking the information away when we found that something is more detail driven. Yeah. And in terms of pacing, we'll talk more about this when we get to next week's lesson. So I'm going to be back next week, and we're going to talk a little bit about what happens when passages include kind of terminology that's a little more dense and difficult to work with, when they're a little more scientific in nature. I know we've gone a little more kind of business, social studies end of things for our past two passages. We're gonna switch gears and get into some sciencey stuff next passage. But essentially, what we want to do is we want to, in our practice, build on the structure that we have so that we are able to identify and keep high value add time that when invested allows us to more efficiently tackle questions, allows us to move more efficiently through the corresponding questions, and identify and minimize or eliminate low value add time. So this is a little lengthier of an answer in terms of, if you're running out of time on the test, to what degree? Do we need to strategically punt a question so that we're catching up on time somewhere in the middle? Or is it more of a construction where we're really running out of time toward the close of the section and we just need to make really powerful, educated guesses? And I have a video, I'll link this one as well. I have a video that deals with pacing strategies and starts to touch in on corresponding pacing strategies for reading comprehension particularly. We can definitely plan to take some more time to talk through those strategies next time as well. I am about out of time for our live viewers. I'll be hanging out though, so if you have any questions, feel free to toss them in the comments, or again, to tag me if you'd prefer. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining me for the second part of our series. As I mentioned, I'll be back same time next week to talk through some more scientific, high vocabulary ridden passage constructions and how we deal with them, and how they shouldn't inherently be more time consuming or more intense than some of the stuff that's easier to break down and comprehend on first read. So with that, thank you guys so much for joining me. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to toss them in the comments, and I hope to see you guys back next week.